Hello everyone and welcome back. This is part 8 of my React Redux and Webpack tutorial series. We have come a long way. We now have a React app up and running, and we learned a little bit about why we want to manage our state using a Flux style architecture. And I hope that in my last video I convinced you that the best way to do this is to use Redux. So in this video we're actually going to implement Redux, and I hope by the end of it we have a functioning to-do list, which was the goal we had when we set out on this series in the first place. So I have my server up and running. If you want to pull the code down for this, this is part 8, so we want to be on the branch part-8-start of my repository, and again it can be found at kyber/react-to-do-list. And if you are forking it and pulling it down, you want to make sure to change to the branch part-8-start. And if you've already forked it from a previous video, and I've since added part 8, you'll want to set this repo as an upstream remote and then pull down the new additions. So the way we left off last time was that we have a text input. Let's get our React DevTools up here. We have our text input component. As part of this, we have an input that we are keeping track of any changes and updating the state. Oops, let's go back here. Called input text, and then we're passing that input text down to text display, which ultimately is just displaying that prop, the input text prop. And then we also added a button in this component that deletes one letter from the state of text input. And the reason it can do that is text display has been passed down the delete letter function as a prop. We're going to get rid of a lot of this stuff because we're going to start building a to-do list. So let's start by getting rid of this stuff and making some changes. So we still need a text input. This is going to be kind of the to-do input where we can type in our to-do that we want to save. We don't really need a text display element. It's really going to be a to-do list. So we can go ahead and start changing some of this stuff. I'm going to go ahead and delete the text display file. Set the text input component, I'm going to rename to to-do input. This means that so I'm going to get rid of the text display import since that doesn't exist anymore. I want to change these text inputs to to-do input. And then we have to go to our app component, and instead of importing text input, we're going to import to-do input. Cool. This header on the text, let's call it to-do list. And then we're going to, under that, it's going to be displaying not the text input, but the to-do input. Let's check out our to-do input component here. We have we're initializing state using the constructor function, and the input text is initial text. Let's change this to be something a little bit different, like let's just make it an empty string since we don't know what our to-do is going to be. In our input element down here, we have a placeholder. This is going to be text. Let's make this placeholder type in your to-do. I'm actually not sure if this is going to show up since we initialize it with an empty string, and then we are telling the value of the input to always be what the input text on state is. So it may actually not show this type in your to-do. It may actually just show a blank string, which is fine for this example. This delete letter function is great, but we don't really need it. Pretty trivial at this point. Contrived, I guess, was the right word there. We still want to handle change, and we want to know what the current text is in there. We're going to keep it on input text. That's great. We now don't have a text display component, so we can get rid of this line. Oops. And let's include a button that just says submit. So this button is going to be clicked when a person is done typing in their to-do and they want to submit it and save it. We'll be attaching some event handlers to here to make it a little bit more useful. Let's go ahead and save both these files. Let's see if our Webpack rebuilt. See what our app looks like. Boom, there's our to-do list, and our placeholder did show up. It showed up, I guess, since an empty string, and input knows not to show an empty string and to show the placeholder text. And then we have this nice submit button, which we can click, but nothing happens. Can we type in? Yes, we can. So everything looks really good right now. What we're going to want to do is we're going to want to include a component below this that's going to be the actual to-do list. So let's go ahead and go to our terminal, and let's make that file. So we're going to call it to-do list.js. Let's go back here. I'm going to cheat a little bit. I'm going to Control A, highlight everything, Command A, and then paste it. This is called to-do list. And for right now, let's keep it simple and just say return a div that says this is the to-do list. Cool. And then what we want to do in our to-do, in our app component, below the to-do input, we want to show the to-do list. Now again, we're referencing it, so we need to first import it. We save that, make sure all the files are saved, and let's see what happened here. I have to restart the server because I stopped it to make the new file. Refresh that. Boom, we have, this is the to-do list right underneath. So everything is set up to, all the components are set up that we're going to need to show these, the to-do list and input a new to-do. So now we're going to actually begin introducing Redux in here. What we're going to do is we're going to keep track of our list of to-dos in our state. And so each to-do is going to be an object. It's going to have a text. It's going to have an ID, so we're keeping track of which to-do is which. And it's going to have a completed property, whether true or false. So we're eventually going to be able to toggle, when we click it, we're going to be able to toggle it completed or not completed. So those are the three things we're keeping track of: the text of the to-do, the ID of it, so we can keep track of it and do things to that specific to-do item, and then the completed, which is going to be a Boolean, true or false. The to-dos, the state is going to be pretty simple. State is going to be an object, and it's going to have one property called to-dos, and that to-dos property is going to be an array, and the array is going to hold each of these to-do items. Again, each of them an object with text, completed, and ID. So that's kind of the general setup of how it's going to happen. I don't know of the best way to start introducing Redux, because as you remember from our last videos, Flux is unidirectional, but it's kind of a circle. So if you introduce one thing, like let's say you start with the store, well, you need the reducers to create the store. And if you have reducers, it means that they know how to handle certain actions, so you have to make the actions. So everything's kind of dependent on something else in the circular chain. But I think it probably helps to introduce actions first. They're very simple, and it really gets the ball rolling. So we will start with actions. But we actually have to start by importing or installing the libraries that we need. And to do this, we're going to do an npm install -- save, so it saves to our package.json. And we're going to save Redux, React Redux, which is some bindings to help us include Redux in our React app. I think that's all we need. Let me make sure. It's easiest just to do it in one go. Yeah, that should be all we need for now. We'll eventually add some dev tools that kind of plug into Redux, but for right now, this is all we need. So let's install that. Cool, that was fast. Again, if you remember from my last video, Redux is a really small library. It's pretty awesome. Let's go to our package.json. Let's make sure we have those now, and we do. We have Redux, and we have React Redux. So everything is looking good. So I'm not sure if there's best practices around folder structure. I think in general in programming, everyone kind of has their own setup. At least for this simple example, it works really well to just put things in a Redux folder. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to make a directory called Redux. So we have a Redux folder, and then I said we're going to start defining some actions. So let's just make a file in the Redux folder called actions.js. Now, the actions themselves, if you'll remember, let's go in here and just have a sandbox to play around with. Actions have a type, so this would be a little spoiler here. Our action is going to be add to do. They're generally strings. What you'll see in some cases is a separate file or some type of constants where you'll have like it'll be this object and the property will be like add to do, and the add to do is just a string add to do. By making it like a property, you don't worry about like misspelling a string. You'll catch the errors a lot earlier. So you would say something like constants dot add to do, and your interpreter would throw an error before it actually tried to run the code. But for simple cases, I don't think we need to keep them as constants. I think making them a string is just fine. So we add it like that. Oops, can you just do that? Yeah, there you go. So every action has to have a type. This is how the reducers know how to handle the action and how to actually update the state. The other thing they need is, well, it depends what they need. In the case of add to do, we're going to have something like the text. So this will be, some string that the user wrote or inputted. So this is the data we need to actually add it to do, because we need to know what the text is so that we can create the to-do. And when we create the to-do, we will set the text equal to this string, and then we will set completed equal to false, and we will set the ID equal to some the next ID in line. And we'll have some helper function do that for us. So this can be anything we want. It could be some type of data, some type of Boolean. It could be nothing. If this action was like toggle switch or something, it would maybe not need any extra data. And so the reducer would know to toggle it to the other one that it currently is not. So the only thing an action actually needs is a type, and it usually has some type of payload that helps us complete the action. So the action itself is just an object that gets returned or gets created. And how we create those is usually with action creators. And so this file name, I've called it actions.js. Really, they are action creators. And components can then call an action creator to fire off an action. So in the case of add to do, we want to create a function that takes in text, so the current text in that input, and creates an action. So creates the object that has both the type and then the payload, the text. So let's, I think we can just do export default actions. I'm getting a little confused, or I'm actually still learning ES6 syntax, but we'll see how this works. And so we want an add to do that takes in text, and what all it does is returns an object that has type add to do, and again this should be a string. And the payload is going to be a property called text, and it's going to be the text that gets passed in. So when we actually call add to do from a component from our actual React app, we will pass in the text that is in that input field into this add to do action. So there's our first action creator that we've made, and then this will eventually get dispatched. So if you'll recall from my last I talked about how my last video, I talked about how the store has a dispatch function that takes in an action. So it'll look something like, and I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but I'm just showing you kind of how this fits into the whole structure of Redux. We will fire an action with, some text. So this is how this will create the action, and then the dispatcher handles the action and sends it off to the reducers. So the reducers are the ones that take in an action in the current state and return your new action. They're the ones that that are pure functions, and so in that way they make no modifications. I'm blanking on the actual word here. I'll think of it. But all they do is they take in the current state and return a new state. So let's set up our reducer. So let's make a file in the Redux folder called reducer.js. So again, we want to export this reducer function. And that doesn't look like good syntax. Unexpected text. There you go. And the reducer is, again, it takes in the current state as the first input, and the second is action. And I mentioned in my last video that generally kind of the best practice is to write your reducers as switch statements. You can write them any way you want. You can do a bunch of if-else clauses, that's fine. Switch statements work well for me. I like doing it. So what we're doing is we're switching on action.type. And what we're saying is, okay, let's look at action.type, and we're going to handle certain cases. So our one case that we want to handle is add to do. So if the action.type is add to do, here's what we do. And before we forget, let's add a default case. You always need a default case in a switch statement. And especially important in Redux, your default case just returns state. So you can have multiple reducers that handle different parts of your state. So if we had a to-do and then we had maybe user data, we might write two separate reducers. So we'd have two separate reducer files. And ultimately, they will get, every time there's a dispatch on the store, each reducer will get their portion of the state. So you might even rename this just to do, because it would be just getting the to-do portion of the state tree. So no matter what, each reducer gets their portion of the state, but it might not be that the action being fired has anything to do with that portion of the state, and so in that case, you're just returning the exact state. And in this way, you're not returning a new state object, you're returning the same state object, and so we know nothing's changed there. Okay, so in our case of add to do, again, we don't want to modify state. So right now, state.todos is going to be our array of to-dos, and so we don't want to do like .push, make a new to-do and push it because we're modifying the same thing. So what we actually want to do is we want to return a new object. And one way to do this is with an ES6 method on the object prototype called assign. And what assign does is it takes objects. So if you had an object like with a property A is 3, and you gave it as a second parameter an object with B is 2, the result of object.assign would be an object with both A as 3 and B as 2. So it combines a bunch of objects into one object, and the object that it modifies is the first object you put into it. So that it actually just copies the properties and values of here and puts them into this object here. So one way to use this to our advantage when we want to create and return a new object is to make the first parameter, the first input to the object.assign function as an empty object. So this is actually our new object that we're going to return. And then what we do is we can just give it a bunch of other objects that it'll take the properties of and add it to this new object. So we already have so what you generally want to do is you want to make this the first parameter as an empty object, and then pass in state. So this just passes in the rest of your state. The interesting, the reason you would do this is because state might be a huge object. So state might have your to-dos array, and it might have other things that you want to copy over. You don't want to lose the data. So you might have like your user data or something. So by doing this, it's going to copy both the current to-dos and the user into this new object, which is great. But we want to update the to-dos array. So to do that, we want to, let's get rid of this. We want to pass in yet another object. And this object is going to have a property to-dos. And this is the thing we're trying to update. So to-dos is an array. And the first item, the first item in this array is going to be our new to-do, right? We want the first to-do to be at the top of the to-do we're adding to be at the top of the list. So this is where we're going to add new to-do info. We want the array to also contain the rest of the to-dos. So how do we do that? Well, one really cool way of doing it is the spread operator. It's an ES6 syntax, and by doing state.todos, what we're doing is we're taking the current state, which is getting passed in, and the current to-dos. This is an array, and when we use the spread syntax, it means it takes every item in that array and kind of just appends it to the rest of this array that we've created. So in this way, we're adding one new to-do here, and then we're adding the rest of the current state.todos. So we'll have the right array that we want. And one thing you might be wondering is when we combined state here, it already had to-dos on it, and so we've already put to-dos into this new object. But what assign does is it overwrites your properties. So it'll first make this new object with the current state.todos inside of it, the current property to-dos inside of it, and then when we give it another object with a property to-dos, it'll overwrite it with what we want. So how do we want to add this new to-do info? What we want to do is we want to make the text equal to the action.text. So if you'll recall, our action creator is returning an object. We're using the type to know what to do, and we're appending the text to it here. So we're just setting the text property equal to the value of action.text. The other thing we want is a completed property, and it's going to be false since it's just being created. And then the last thing we need is an ID to keep track of things. We'll see why we need this in a second. And I'm going to write a helper function called getID. And I'm going to pass in state to know what the next ID is that I can use that is unique. I think I'm missing the end parentheses here from the assign function, and that goes away. That's great. Let's write that helper function, getID. This is going to take in the current state. And what we're going to do is, I'm cheating, I'm copying this from something I already wrote. We're going to use a reduce function. We're basically, I'm using some ES6 syntax here as well. And we're basically looping through the current to-dos and looking at each of their IDs, and we're finding the max ID. And that's what this reduce function is doing. And it starts with negative. We initialize the reduce function with an initial value of -1, and of course, as it loops through, it's going to find that to-do.id is larger than -1, so it's going to set max ID to be the new max. And so by the time we've looped through it, we've found what the maximum ID is, and all we're going to do after that is this is going to return the max ID, and we're just going to add 1. So that should get us our updated ID, and it'll put it here to our new to-do. So we actually have all the functionality in place to create an action to add a to-do, and then the reducer will actually be able to update the store, the current state, with the new ID. So this is pretty cool. Now we have to actually be able to create the store and kind of implement it into our app. So to do this, let's create our store, or really our store configuration function. So we're going to create another file in our Redux folder called store.js. You might see this called configure store because it's not actually the store that's being configured here. We're configuring the configuration. So it kind of doesn't make sense right now, but basically we're creating a function that's going to be able to take in your initial state and kind of start the store. And where we actually create the store using this function is going to be in our entry point to our app. So instead of just starting it with this app and not doing anything, we're going to first configure and create our store. And what that means basically is that we're going to create, it's going to look something like create store with your reducers and your initial state. So in our case, it'll be just an empty array of to-dos or something like that. And then we pass this is going to be your store, and then you pass in the store into your app. And we'll get there in a minute, but that's kind of the general setup of what's going to happen. So let's see now how we kind of set up this store. This is where we actually start using some Redux components, and so we're actually going to import the create store method from the Redux library. Again, when we configure a store, we need to add the reducers and the initial state. And so here is where we kind of create our configure store. This is actually going to be export default. It's going to be a function, configure store. That takes in an initial state. And the initial state is either going to be supplied to us, and if it's not, our default is going to be an object with a to-dos property being an empty array. So this is a little bit tricky. Let me continue on. What we're going to return out of this is we're going to return a function we're going to return the create store method from the Redux library, and it's going to contain our reducer and the initial state. So this looks a little bit contrived. You're probably wondering why whenever we actually call this, why don't we just import it there? I said we're going to actually call it over here. The reason you want to kind of separate it out is because we can add middleware, and we will actually add some of this either at the end of this video or during the next video. But let me first go over a few things here with the ES6 syntax. This equals is a default, so if initial state is not passed into this configure store, then it will default to be an object with a to-dos property with an empty array. This would be equivalent, this equals part here, if we got rid of this, would be equivalent to saying initial state equals initial state, or if it's undefined, then it would be your to-dos empty array. It's just a lot, you just kind of get rid of this line with the ES6 syntax like that. So basically, when we import this file, we're going to get our function that we can pass in an initial state, and it will run the Redux create store with that initial state and our reducer. And I'm referencing reducer here, so that means I'm going to have to import it. And this is in the same file or same folder, and then it's just called reducer. You can leave off the .js. We'll get back to adding middleware. This is to do, pun intended. Okay, so we've set up our kind of configure store functionality, and now we can actually configure it. So where does this happen? Well, I'm just going through and saving all this. Let's close some of these files. I mentioned up here that this is where we actually configure it. So this is our entry point to our app. This is where we initialize the store, and we'll eventually pass it down into our app and allow our app to know about this store and allow our store to throw down, new state information when it occurs and throw it down as props. So here is where I'm actually going to set an initial state. So if you haven't seen the let keyword, this is very similar to var, but it scopes it. Here it would function the same as var, but you can put let inside of a function, and it scopes, or inside of an if clause, and it scopes that variable just to that scope, for lack of a better word. It keeps any references of that variable meaningful only in that scope, whereas var doesn't let you do that for like if else clauses. And so in general, I believe, and I could be wrong, but you can basically replace var with let when you use ES6. The other new one in ES6 is const, which is when something will never change. So it's not really like, you can't variably change its value that it references. It just is what it is, which is useful too. So our initial state is going to be an object, and let's make it equal to that. assign it. And it's going to have our to-dos property with an array. And let's see, let's just initialize it with one object. So let's make it one to do. So let's make an ID of 0. Completed is false, and our text is going to be, initial to do for demo purposes. Cool. So that's our initial state, and then what we want to do is we want to create our store. So let store assign it. We want to import, first we want to import, First we want to import our configure store function that we had just written. So this is up one, and then in Redux, and then in the store folder. So now we can call that function, and again it takes in, let's go back to it. It takes in an initial state. So, oops. We want to configure store is what we called it, and we want to pass in this initial state that we just created up here. So there's our store, and now the last thing to do is actually hook it up into the app. And so I believe you can handle things on your own, meaning you can like kind of pass in the store as a property, and then in the app have to handle things when things change. But what we're going to do is we're going to use a component that's part of the React Redux library that we installed when we started this video. And what it is, it's called Provider. It's just a React component, and it helps us connect the store to our actual components that need to know about it. And all the provider does is it wraps around your entire app, and it gets the store that you create here passed to it as a prop. And we'll see once this is hooked up how we can use it to actually pass data into our app. But for now, what we want to do is we want to include it as a component. We want to create a prop on it called store, and we're going to pass in the store that we just created here on line 15. And then we want to wrap it around our app component, and we can do that just like so. In this render function, you can put as many components, nested components, as you'd like. Cool. So everything is set up. I am not sure what's going to happen if we run our app right now. What I do know is that we haven't explicitly told any components to actually grab data from the store, grab the state, and do anything with it. But it seems like we've been coding for a while, so I always like to kind of run our app and see what's going on. So let's see if we get any errors, if Webpack can build it. We have our server is listening. Webpack built. Looks like we have an error of some sort. It says here initial state is not defined in store line 7. Let's head over there. I spelled it wrong up here. Cool, save that. Did it rebuild? Yes, it did. We got an error? No? Yeah, cool. So we're back up and running. Obviously, I haven't changed any of our components, so we're not actually showing this. I haven't set up anything on the submit button, so we're not really seeing what's going on. So let us, what should we do now? I think it's about time to see if we can fire off an action. So what I want to happen is when I hit the submit button, I want to fire off this action of add to do. The problem is we don't have anything set up to show our to-dos. Again, our to-do list is just a div Our to-do list component is just a div showing this, and the app isn't handling the state that it could potentially be getting from provider, from the store. We're going to want to be able to see this happening. We want to see that the store is actually making some of these changes. So I actually think what I'm going to do now, we had some commented code here to add middleware. I actually think this would be a great time to go ahead and do that. So every time an action comes in and the dispatcher dispatches that action and passes it off to the reducers, you have this moment where you can kind of attach middleware and do something. You can log, you can really do whatever you want, actually. And so if you're a developer and you have a cool tool you think would be useful, you can go ahead and build it and kind of help out the ecosystem. But the one thing that it's really useful for is logging. So there's a really cool library called Redux-Logger that we're going to go ahead and install. And what this does is you can actually pass it, you can configure it however you'd like, but what it does as a default is just log every action, the previous state, the action, and the new state. So it allows you in your console to see things that are happening. And I'd like to include this so that when we hook up our submit button, when we go into our app and hit submit, I want to see that action happening, and we can kind of see what the store looks like even before we've hooked it up to our app, which is just a little bit complicated at times. So we have the Redux logger. Let's head into the store. Let's add the middleware. So what I like to do is I like to call this like final create store. So this is going to basically take our middleware and add it to this create store, so that instead of returning create store down here, we're going to return final create store. And one thing we can do is we can use some methods from the Redux library. But the cool thing is that all of this stuff are just functions. It's just functions that get some added functionality and then return a new function. But Redux supplies some of these methods. And again, Redux is such a small library that you'd have no problem going in here and looking at how this is done. And it's not really that magical. But what we can do here is we can use the compose function, which just allows us to then call the apply middleware function, and we want to apply the logger, and I need to import it. So we've imported it, and here's where we can do config stuff, but I just want to use the default. So we're applying the logger, and then the compose function composes those together, and then we need to add it to the create store. So this gives back our compose returns a function which then takes in create store, which composes it together into this final create store, which we're putting here. Cool. So let's make sure our app is still up and running, that we didn't break anything. Cool, we're good to go. So now let's hook up this to-do input button down here, this submit button. Let's hook it up so that it fires off an action. It fires the add to-do action. So we want to handle an on-click handler, and we will create like a handle submit function. And as you can remember up here, we're going to need to bind this potentially. I'm not sure if we're going to reference the component itself. But anyway, let's get the handle submit. It is going to take in, it could take in the event, and we might want to do that because we might want to prevent default. so that the page doesn't refresh on us. And then what we want to do is we want to fire off an action. So unfortunately, we have no way to fire off that action. We can create an action, so we can import our actions file and kind of fire it off, but that wouldn't do much of anything. It would just return an object. If you'll recall, we need to, and I kind of wrote this here. I wonder if that was actually dispatching. No, we would have seen it in the log. Anyway, we need to have access to the dispatch on the store. So I actually kind of started going down this path because I wanted to see if we could fire off an action. But we actually do need to first set up the connection between the provider and our app itself. Again, the provider is just a component that allows us easily to connect the components that we'd like to connect to the store. So let's see how we do that. The way we do that is by using a method from the React Redux library, which kind of makes sense because that's where the provider component comes from. And we can do it in the components where we want to connect the store to the component. So in this case, we want the app to be the connection. We want it to get all of the state. So we're going to use a method in this React Redux library called connect. Now, what connect does is it takes your, it creates a function that can take in the component that you're interested in connecting to your store, and it returns this new connected component. This new connected component will then be able to listen for changes in the provider, or in the store, and it can get it from the provider. And so, yeah, this is a little confusing, and I don't think I'm explaining it too well, but I'm just going to keep going so we see how this plays out. So instead of exporting just our app component, we want to export this quote-unquote connected app component. So what you want to do at the bare minimum is something like this. But what Connect allows you to do, and what you're probably going to want to do, is you're going to want to map state to props. So this is just something that I made up. So we're going to have to define it. So this is going to be a function called map state to props. And what map state to props does is it's a function. So the connect is going to call, it's going to expect a function as its first input, and it's going to throw in state to that function. And what you want to do is then return the part of the state that you want this component, so this app component, to get. We want all of it. And I'm actually not entirely sure about this, but I think if you don't include this, it will just pass in the whole of the state. But in this case, we could have done something like state.todos, or if this was another component of our app, state.userdata, or something like that, where we only want a certain amount of it. Excuse me. This means down here that we're not actually exporting our app, we're actually exporting this connected app that's going to get the state passed into it as props. So we're going to save that, save everything that we've done. Let's just, this was our handle submit event handler on our button. Let's just log submit button click just to see things are working. Webpack rebuilt. Cool, everything's up and running. If we hit submit, we get that. That's working. Let's see what's happening in React here. So we have this provider, and it has a store the store has dispatch, it has get state, which I described in my last video. That's great. We have this connected app, which is pretty cool. And then the connected app is really what is kind of connecting this app to the provider. And so all of a sudden, because we mapped state to the props, app now has the props of to-dos. And it's an array with one, and it has our initial to-do for demo purposes, which is pretty cool. So what this means is that we've now hooked up the state to talk to this app component. And so at this point, app has access to this .props.todos, and it can do something with those to-dos. So now that we have that, let's display it in our to-do list. Instead of just having this header here, let's actually make it show something. So we know our app has access to this .state. This .props.todos is an array. So in our to-do list, let's make a prop called to-dos, and let's set it equal to this .props.todos. Okay. Now, if we save that, I'm going back to the browser. We'll see that if we open this up and go to to-do list now has access to an array of to-dos. It currently only has one, but pretty awesome. So now let's see how we can display this. So instead of returning a div, we're going to actually want to make this multi-line. We are going to want to loop through so we know we have access to this .props.todos. What we want to do is we want to loop through that, and for every to-do we want to display it in like a list item. So we're going to want an overarching, yeah, it can be unordered list. I guess it really is an ordered list, but this is fine for now. And then within here, we want a list of, to-do ID 0, and then to-do, and we want each of these to be a list item. Something like that. So how do we loop through, and how do we actually make that show up for every single one? Well, one thing you can do is you can, since it's just JSX, we can use curly braces, and we can start writing in some JavaScript. And we want to map so map is a function on arrays where you pass in a function to map, and that function tells you what you want to do for every item of that array, and then it'll return a new array with this mapped version of each item. So we have for each, I'm going to use some ES6 syntax, bear with me. So we're going to map over each item, and this function is going to get called for each to-do item of this array. We want to return a list item. This list item is going to have a key of to-do.id. And the text is going to be to-do.text. So this is going to map over every to-do in this to-do array, and for each to-do, we're going to do this function. We're going to return a list item with a key, and this is important, and React will throw a really actually descriptive error if you don't do it. But when you map over something and create elements, React needs to be able to keep track of each specific element, and so it needs a unique key and it'll warn you if you don't have it. And then we just want to display the text inside the list element. So I'm going to save this. Let's see what happens. There you go. So we have 1. But unfortunately, it's only 1, and we can't really see that our map function is working. So wouldn't it be nice if we could add a to-do to this list? And in fact, we can. So let's see how we do that. I'm checking out our to-do list item, and it has a prop of to-do. What it doesn't have is... So, okay, before we go there, let's go back to what I was talking about with how we actually dispatch an action. We need access to the dispatcher. And unfortunately, the dispatcher lives in the store and not on any specific component. But when we ran this connect function and got access to to-dos, the connect function also gives us access to the dispatch function. And so it's easy enough to go into your code, and when we know we're going to need to dispatch actions, we also pass down dispatch where it's needed, and in this case we need it in to-do list. So if we save this and head back to our app and go to our to-do list, we now have access to dispatch. This means that we can do something like dispatch. We don't need this since it's giving us the method. We just run dispatch, add to do, and we add whatever text is in there. Luckily, this is all set up. We know what text is in there because we've been keeping track of it on state. So the cool thing about this, give me 1 second. The cool thing about this is that here with handle submit, all we have to do is this .props.dispatch, and we're going to do add to do, and the add to do is going to be this.state.input text. Now, where's add to do coming from? Well, let's import it. So import add to do from our action creators, which live up, and then in Redux, and then actions. So if we save that, I made some random changes here. Let's get rid of that, save it. How is this doing? Actions is not defined in actions 1. Okay, so my syntax with the export default was a little weird. Instead, I defined the variable, or the let actions, and then export default it. So let's see what happens when we type in test to do. We hit submit. Cool. We get an error on to do input, line 21. Let's see what's going on there. So it's saying underscore actions dot add to do is not a function. So that means possibly that this will probably work. So again, my syntax was off here. I apologize for that. We're defining an object called actions, which is exported from this file as the default. We need to make properties on this object. And so that other syntax I had was more like class syntax. This is more standard JavaScript. I should have just stuck with this from the start. But this is just one property, and this property is a function. So save everything, refresh it. So test to do, submit. It's still not a function. So the last thing I'm thinking is my syntax on this import is a little off. So let's import it as actions and do actions.addToDo. This.props.dispatch is not a function. So this is on to-do input. Okay. So I had passed dispatch into to-do list, but I actually need it in to-do input. That's my fault. So in app here, we are going to get rid of this and put it here. Save that. Try it again. Still nothing. Cool. So we can see down here when I hit submit, we did fire an action. It was called add to do, and we have a previous state, which is our to-dos of length 1. We have our action, which looks good. It has a type and a text, but it doesn't seem to have updated. So our array is still looks like this. So this means possibly that our reducer is not doing its job correctly. So let's look at what our reducer is doing. So I'm going to change the syntax here. I think it might have been working all right, but we're going to do it a little bit more for sure. So case, that looks good, the add to do. The object.assign looks like it's doing okay. This state.todos is doing okay. And it might have been just getting to the default and returning state, or it wasn't going through here. So let's put a log statement here. Got to correct add to do case. So here I see I get to the right case, except my function is not working to actually correctly add a to do. So let's see what's going on here. So as you can see, these cases need to be, they're like functions that are being run, and they need to have a return statement, and I was not returning this. Let's see what happens now. The reason I'm refreshing is because the the Redux folder is triggering a restart of my node server, and so yeah, I'm restarting it. I'm not sure if I need to. There you go. So now that I'm returning something from my reducer, I get object, and my next state has an object, and the to-dos array has a length of 2, and it has it has my updated to-do item. So let's add another to-do item. Hit submit. There you go. So it's working now. We've learned how to set up Redux in our application. We've learned how to add actions, how to add reducers that can take those actions and be dispatched onto the store and ultimately update the store with a new state. And we've learned how to connect all this to our components in React. In the next video, we're going to continue this app. We're going to allow functionality and see how we can add completion functionality and how we can delete this and keep adding some more actions, among other things that we can do with Redux. So hope to see you then.